I've been really curious to see how Wuthering Waves was going to continue the story after the first half of 3.1, especially because that chapter was so emotionally charged and left things in a very intense place. And after playing through part 2, I can safely say that this was exactly the kind of continuation the story needed. This isn't a chapter that tries to outdo what came before it. It doesn't escalate, it doesn't pile on more drama, and it doesn't rush toward another big moment. Instead, it works as an intermission, a short pause that lets the story breathe after everything that happened in part 1. What surprised me is just how much it manages to do in such a short amount of time. We're introduced to a new character, Luke, and we learn quite a bit about his relationship with Rover and who they were before Rover lost their memories. At the same time, the story doesn't forget about what just happened. We still get meaningful progression on the antagonist side as well. All of that happened in what is probably the shortest main story segment we've had so far. It never feels rushed or unfocused. So in this video I want to talk about why this kind of quieter continuation works so well, what it tells us about how Wuthering Waves is handling its story going forward, and why this felt like such a strong follow-up to part 1. After an episode as emotionally heavy as part 1, the worst thing the story can do is try to immediately top itself. Constant escalation might sound exciting on paper, but in practice it usually leads to burnout, both for the characters and for the audience. That's why this chapter being an intermission matters so much. It gives the story space to reset its emotional pacing without resetting its direction. Nothing here is trying to outshine what came before it. Instead, it slows things down and focuses on groundwork. A big part of that groundwork is exposition, and normally that's the kind of word that makes people tune out. But exposition isn't bad storytelling, bad exposition is. What makes this work is how restrained it is. This is a short chapter, less than an hour, and because of that the information it delivers never overstays its welcome. You're not sitting through endless explanations or lore dumps, you're getting just enough context to understand where the story is heading next. This is also the kind of chapter that some people will naturally find boring, especially if they're only looking for big moments or dramatic payoffs. And that's fair, not every story beat is meant to be exciting in the same way. But from a storytelling perspective, this is exactly what's supposed to happen here. After a major emotional peak, stories need a valley. They need a moment where the focus shifts from payoff to setup, from reaction to preparation. What's important is that this intermission doesn't feel like a filler, it doesn't forget what just happened, and it doesn't wander off into something unrelated. It stays focused, it stays brief, and it respects the emotional weight of the previous chapter instead of trying to drown it out. In other words, this isn't a case of the story slowing down because it has nothing to say. It's slowing down because it knows what it needs to say next, and is taking the time to say it properly. One of the things I was paying very close attention to going into part 2 was how they were going to handle the introduction of a new character. In gacha stories especially, new characters tend to come with a very specific risk. The story often leans hard into them, their trauma, their conflict, their entire character arc, and if that happens at the wrong time, it can completely derail the momentum of what came before. Coming right after the emotionally heavy arc in part 1, that risk was very real here. If the story had suddenly shifted all of its focus onto Luke, it could have easily undermined everything that was still unresolved. But that's not what happens, and that's where this part gets really interesting. The clever choice here is that Luke isn't introduced at the beginning of his character arc. We're not meeting him at the moment of his greatest conflict or transformation. Instead, he's already past that point. Very briefly speaking, most character arcs move through a few broad stages, from establishing the status quo, to conflict and transformation, to resolution. What makes Luke work in this story is that he's already gone through the first two. The emotional struggle that defines him has already happened, and we're meeting him somewhere in between transformation and resolution. That immediately changes how much narrative weight he demands. The story doesn't need to stop and unpack everything about him, because his arc isn't being performed for the audience in real time, it's being revealed through context. A big part of that context is his past relationship with Rover. We learn that it was Rover's influence that helped Luke reach this point in his life, to step away from being completely consumed by his anger towards the antagonist group, and instead learn how to live with those emotions without letting them consume him. Bringing him into Star Torch Academy as a teacher reinforces that idea beautifully. It's not just a plot excuse to place him in the story, it's a visual and thematic way of showing where he is emotionally. He's not just fighting anymore, he's stabilizing. And because of that, Luke doesn't hijack the narrative. He's integrated into the story alongside the other central elements of this chapter, instead of competing with them. We learn a lot about him, but never at the expense of what the story is already building towards. For a short intermission chapter like this, that balance is incredibly important. Luke feels meaningful, not overwhelming, and that's exactly why his introduction works as well as it does here. Another thing I was really curious about going into part 2 was how the story was going to handle Amed, because this is still the emotional core of everything that just happened. There was a very real risk of both sides here. If the story leaned too hard into immediately pushing the plot forward, it could have felt rushed, like it was trying to move past the emotional weight of part 1 too quickly. But if it didn't acknowledge Amed properly or treated her situation as something to deal with later, the continuation could have easily felt lukewarm or disconnected. What I really like is that the story finds its balance through the protagonist. We're shown very clearly that Rover is still deeply affected by what happened. There's this strong immediate desire to just go out there and try to save Aemeath as quickly as possible, to act first and deal with the consequences later. That emotional impulse makes complete sense, and it's important that the story doesn't ignore it. At the same time, part 2 doesn't let that impulse completely take over the narrative, and this is where Luke's role becomes especially important. He acts as a kind of emotional anchor for Rover, not by shutting those feelings down, but by helping them avoid being consumed by them. Through their interactions, we also get to see Rover's doubts come to the surface. There's an underlying fear there, the question of whether they'll actually be able to save Aemeath at all, and what it would mean if they fail. That uncertainty adds a lot of depth to the protagonist, and it's a continuation of the character growth that started in part 1. I've mentioned this in my previous video, but this evolution of the protagonist is still one of my favorite aspects of Wuthering Waves' story right now. Rover feels less like a passive viewpoint character and more like someone whose internal state actually matters to how the story unfolds. The relationship between Rover and Luke plays a big role in that. It's a very different dynamic from what Rover has with Amed. It's not as intense or emotionally charged, but it doesn't need to be. It works because it's supportive and stabilizing rather than transformative. And that's exactly what this part of the story needs. Part 2 stays close to the emotional aftermath of part 1 without trying to replicate it. It doesn't drift away, and it doesn't rush forward either. Everything here feels like a continuation that understands its place in the larger arc. Close enough to matter, restrained enough to breathe. The last thing I want to talk about here is the antagonist side of the story, specifically the Fractious, because this part becomes especially interesting when you look at it in the context of everything that came before. After part 1, this central group of antagonists felt strangely invisible, and that's largely because of Aleph 1, the Trenodian. It's such an overwhelmingly powerful presence that it completely reframed the scale of the conflict. Compare that to everything that Fractious had been doing up until this point suddenly felt small, almost meaningless by comparison. So going into part 2, I was very curious about how, or even when, the story was going to bring them back into focus. What we get here isn't a full confrontation, and it's not meant to be. The central conflict of this chapter is still the protagonist's emotional state and Luke's role in stabilizing that. The antagonist's side functions as one of several parallel threads, and more specifically, a setup for what's coming next. And that's exactly why this moment matters. After my last video about antagonist structures, I've been paying a lot more attention to how long-running stories handle these kinds of villains groups, especially the pattern where they're always progressing their plan while the protagonists are stuck reacting to it. Here, it feels like Wuthering Waves might be positioning itself to take a step forward, not by resolving the conflict outright, but by reasserting the Fractious as active participants in the narrative again, not just background forces waiting for their next inevitable win. It's still too early to say whatever this will lead to a real structural change, but there are signs that the story wants to do something different. We're made aware of new figures connected to this group, and the framing suggests movement rather than stasis. And honestly, that's exactly what needed at this point. The story has been circling the same antagonist structure for a long time, and while it would have been better to see the shift happen earlier, it's still better late than never. This is one of those things I'm most interested in watching going forward, whether Wuthering Waves finally breaks out of that familiar stalemate, or whether this turns out to be another setup that never quite pays off. Either way, this chapter makes it clear that fractious aren't meant to stay invisible, and that alone makes this moment worth paying attention to. When I look at 3.1 Part 2 as a whole, what stands out most to me isn't any single scene or revelation, it's the confidence behind the way this chapter is structured. This is a short, quiet intermission that understands its role. It slows things down after an emotionally intense arc, delivers necessary exposition without dragging, introduces a new character without hijacking the story, keeps Amed as the emotional through line through the protagonist, and quietly repositions the antagonists for what comes next. None of that is flashy, and that's kind of the point. For a long time, Wuthering Waves has always felt like a game with a very strong identity in terms of atmosphere, music, and presentation. Narratively though, it often felt like it was still leaning on familiar gacha patterns, the kind of structures that are easy to default to in live service storytelling. What this chapter suggests to me is that the story is finally starting to move beyond that. There's a noticeable shift towards restraint, towards letting characters' moments breathe, and towards trusting that not every story beat needs to escalate to justify its existence. That doesn't mean everything is suddenly perfect, or that all of that long-term structural issues are resolved. It's still too early to say how some of these threads will pay off, but it does feel like the narrative is becoming more self-aware, more comfortable doing things its own way rather than following a familiar framework just because it's expected. If this is the direction Wuthering Waves continues to lean into, then chapters like this will matter a lot more in hindsight than they might seem right now. Not because they were dramatic, but because they show the story learning how to pace itself, how to integrate its characters, and how to build towards something without constantly rushing there. And for a long-running story like this, that kind of narrative confidence might be the most important development of all. If you enjoy this kind of slower, more reflective look at the story, feel free to leave a like. It really helps this video reach people who care about this kind of analysis. And if you want more videos breaking down storytelling in gacha games and long-running series like this, you can subscribe. That's pretty much what this channel is about. I'm especially curious to hear what other people think about this chapter, whether it worked for you or if you were hoping for something bigger after part 1. And if you've been following Wuthering Waves for a long time, I'd love to hear how this part felt in the context of the broader story. Now, if you want to keep going, I'll leave another video on the screen here that you might find interesting. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.